In February 1946, newspapers across the world declared a miracle. The University of Pennsylvania had unveiled ENIAC, the first electronic computer in history. Thousands of vacuum tubes, 18,000 of them, working in perfect harmony to solve problems no human mind could tackle. The American press went wild with pride. But it was a lie. 2 years earlier, in a secret room beneath the English countryside, a post office engineer named Tommy Flowers had already built something far more advanced. Not 1,800 tubes, 1,800 tubes, working flawlessly, cracking codes the Germans believed were mathematically unbreakable. His machine was called Colossus, and it was the world's first programmable electronic computer. The Americans got the glory. Flowers got nothing, not even his name in the history books. For 30 years, he was forbidden to speak about what he had done. The British government classified it, buried it, and let the world believe the Americans had won the race. When Flowers tried to get a bank loan after the war, they laughed at him. He told them he had built a machine with nearly 2,000 vacuum tubes. Impossible, they said. No one could make that many tubes work together without constant failures. He had built 10 of them, but he could not tell them that. This is the story of the man who invented the computer age with his own money, his own sweat, and his own genius, and then watched as history erased him. But why did Britain bury this achievement? To understand that, you need to know what Flowers was fighting against. Early 1943. Bletchley Park had cracked Enigma, the cipher machine everyone knows about. Alan Turing and his team could read German naval messages, Wehrmacht communications, Luftwaffe orders. It was a triumph, but it was not enough. Because Hitler was not using Enigma. The Führer had something else, something far more sophisticated. It was called the Lorenz cipher, and it was reserved for the highest level of German command. Hitler to Rommel, Hitler to von Rundstedt. The messages that decided where armies would move, where defenses would be built, when counterattacks would come. This was not field chatter. This was strategic gold, and it was mathematically unbreakable. Enigma had millions of possible settings. Lorenz had trillions upon trillions. Some estimates put it at 10 to the power of 19 combinations. To put that in perspective, if every person on Earth spent every second of their life testing settings, the sun would burn out before they found the right one. The code breakers at Bletchley Park called it fish. They had intercepted these encrypted teleprinter messages since 1940, watched them multiply as the war intensified, knew they contained the most vital intelligence of the war. But intercept was one thing. Breaking was another. Every day, dozens of these messages arrived, each one potentially containing the exact location of panzer divisions, the strength of coastal fortifications, the Wehrmacht's assessment of Allied intentions, and every day they sat there, unreadable. The Allies were planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. D-Day, June 1944. The fate of Europe depended on it, but without knowing where the German panzers were concentrated, where Rommel expected the landings, where the Atlantic Wall was weakest, it would be a slaughter. Thousands of young men would hit the beaches blind, running straight into prepared defenses. They needed Lorenz broken, and they needed it fast. Bletchley Park had tried. They built a machine called Heath Robinson, a contraption of paper tape and photoelectric readers. It was painfully slow, constantly breaking down, reading maybe 1,000 characters per second. The paper tape tore. The synchronization failed. The photoelectric cells misread the holes. At that speed, it would take weeks to crack a single message. By the time they decoded it, the information would be useless. Rommel would have moved his tanks. The invasion window would have closed. What they needed was not an improvement. They needed a revolution. The man who would deliver that revolution was not who anyone expected. Thomas Harold Flowers was born in 1905 in Poplar, East End of London. Not Oxbridge, not the suburbs. The East End, where the docks were, where working men lived in cramped terraces, where you could smell the Thames at low tide. His father was a bricklayer. His mother took in sewing. There were no family connections, no university legacy, no trust fund to fall back on. Flowers left school at 14 and went to work as an apprentice mechanical engineer. But he was hungry for more. While other lads spent their evenings at the pub, Flowers attended night classes at the University of London. Electrical engineering? Mathematics? He absorbed it all, working days, studying nights, earning his degree one exhausting semester at a time. By 1926, he had joined the General Post Office as a probationary engineer. The GPO was not glamorous. It was telephone exchanges, relay switches, maintenance work. But Flowers saw potential where others saw drudgery. He began experimenting with electronic telephone switching, using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical relays. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. Tubes were unreliable, they said, too delicate, too prone to failure. Flowers proved them wrong. He built systems with hundreds of tubes running continuously, and they worked. More than that, they were faster, more efficient, and more flexible than anything mechanical could achieve. By the late 1930s, he was running the switching group at the Post Office Research Station in Dollis Hill, North London. He had become one of Britain's leading experts on electronic engineering. But he was still a post office engineer, not a Cambridge don, not a decorated academic. When war broke out and Bletchley Park began recruiting the brightest minds in Britain, they looked to the universities. Mathematicians like Turing, linguists, chess champions, men who could think in abstract patterns, who could see structures in chaos. They did not look at Dollis Hill, and that was their mistake, because while the academics at Bletchley Park understood the theory of codebreaking, they did not understand engineering. They could design algorithms on paper, but they could not build machines that actually worked. That gap between theory and reality was where wars were lost. In February 1943, a man named Max Newman arrived at Dollis Hill with a desperate request. Newman was a Cambridge mathematician, part of the Bletchley Park elite. He explained the Lorenz problem. He showed Flowers the plans for Heath Robinson, the paper tape machine that kept failing. He asked if Flowers could improve it. Flowers looked at the plans and shook his head. "You cannot fix this," he said. "The whole approach is wrong. Paper tape will never be fast enough, never reliable enough. You need something entirely different." Newman asked what he had in mind. Flowers told him, electronic switching, vacuum tubes, thousands of them, working in parallel, processing the cipher at speeds no mechanical system could match. No paper tape, except for the input message itself. Everything else held in electronic memory, reconfigurable, programmable. Newman stared at him. "That is impossible," he said. "No one has ever made that many tubes work together. They will fail constantly. The heat alone would destroy them." Flowers had heard that before, and he knew it was nonsense. Flowers knew vacuum tubes could work reliably because he had already done it. At Dollis Hill, he had systems running with 300 tubes, operating around the clock, month after month, with failure rates far lower than anyone predicted. The secret was simple. Do not turn them off. The stress that destroyed tubes was not heat, it was thermal shock. Switching them on and off, heating and cooling the filaments, that was what caused failures. Keep them running continuously, and they would last for years. But Bletchley Park did not believe him. Newman took the proposal back to his superiors. The reaction was immediate and hostile. 1,800 vacuum tubes? Madness. Gordon Welchman, one of the senior cryptanalysts, was particularly scathing. He accused Flowers of squandering good valves on a fantasy project when those tubes were desperately needed for radar, for radio communications, for equipment that actually worked. The establishment had its own plan. They would fix Heath Robinson. More engineers, better paper tape, improved synchronization. They had already invested months of work into it. Abandoning that approach for an untested electronic system felt like reckless gambling. And Flowers, despite his expertise, was an outsider. He did not have a Cambridge degree. He had not published academic papers. He worked for the post office, for goodness sake. Why should they trust him over their own experienced team? There was another problem. Vacuum tube production was genuinely limited. Britain was fighting a total war on multiple fronts. Every tube had to be justified, allocated, tracked. The bureaucracy around procuring 1,800 tubes for an experimental machine with no guarantee of success was immense. Flowers tried to explain. He showed them his track record at Dollis Hill. He explained the engineering principles. He demonstrated that the real bottleneck in Heath Robinson was not the electronics, but the mechanical paper tape system, which tore, stretched, and misaligned constantly. They were not interested. Bletchley Park had academics and mathematicians. They did not need a post office engineer telling them how to build machines. If Flowers wanted to pursue this ridiculous idea, he could do it on his own time. They would not fund it. They would not assign resources to it. They would not even formally authorize it. The official record later described their position with clinical understatement. They merely encouraged him to proceed on his own. Translation: You are on your own. If it works, we will take the credit. If it fails, you will take the blame. But Max Newman, to his credit, did not abandon Flowers. He believed in the concept, even if he doubted the execution. He secured a small amount of support, enough to let Flowers start. But no money, no staff, no official backing, and the clock was ticking. It was February 1943. D-Day was planned for sometime in 1944. That gave Flowers roughly 1 year to design, build, test, and deploy a machine more complex than anything ever attempted. A machine that most of the British establishment believed was impossible. What happened next would define the rest of his life. Flowers made a decision that would have destroyed most men. If the government would not fund the machine, he would fund it himself. He went to his bank and withdrew £1,000, his life savings. Everything he had put aside over 20 years of steady work, every penny saved from his post office salary, the money meant for his family's future. In 1943, that was not pocket change. Adjusted for inflation, it is worth more than £58,000 today. For a civil servant engineer, it was a fortune. And he gambled it all on a machine the experts said could not work. His boss at Dollis Hill, a man named Gordon Radley, was the only one who backed him. Radley saw what Flowers could do, trusted his judgment, and quietly diverted post office resources to support the project. Staff, workshop space, materials. Radley was risking his own career, but he believed in Flowers. Without that support, Colossus would never have been built. Flowers assembled a team of 50 engineers and technicians, not cryptanalysts, not academics, working men, draftsmen, metalworkers, electricians, technicians who could turn theoretical designs into physical reality. They worked in a basement workshop at Dollis Hill, surrounded by lathes and soldering irons, building something no one had ever seen before. 11 months, February to December 1943. That was the deadline Flowers set himself. 11 months to design the circuits, source the components, assemble the frames, wire the panels, test the logic, and debug the system. No one outside Dollis Hill believed it was possible. Even inside, there were doubts. 1,800 vacuum tubes had never been synchronized before. The heat dissipation alone was a nightmare. The power consumption would be enormous. And if even one tube failed at the wrong moment, the entire calculation could be ruined. But Flowers had done the mathematics. He knew the failure rates. He knew how to design redundancy. He knew how to cool the system. And most importantly, he knew how to keep the tubes alive. They would run continuously, never switched off, never thermal shocked. The machine would stay powered 24 hours a day. That was the key. The work was brutal. 6-day weeks, 10-hour shifts, constant problem-solving. Every subsystem had to be hand-built. Every connection had to be soldered and tested. There were no off-the-shelf components for what they were building. They had to invent as they went, designing custom circuits, fabricating custom racks, solving problems that had never existed before. The machine itself was immense, 8 feet tall, 17 feet wide, 11 feet deep, weighing more than a ton. The frames were built from metal shelving, the kind you would find in any post office storeroom, because that was what they had available. Inside, row after row of vacuum tubes glowed like a wall of amber light. Miles of wire connected them, every connection hand-soldered, every circuit tested individually before integration. And all the while, the war ground on. German U-boats were still sinking convoys in the Atlantic. Bomber Command was losing planes over Germany. The Red Army was bleeding at Kursk. Young men were fighting and suffering while Flowers and his team worked in a basement, building a machine most people thought was a waste of time. But Flowers never stopped. His money was gone. His savings account was empty. If the machine failed, he would have nothing. No reimbursement, no compensation, just debt and ruin. December 1943 arrived. The machine was complete. All 1,800 tubes installed, wired, and ready. Flowers stood in front of it, this towering assembly of metal and glass, and threw the switch. The tubes glowed, the circuits hummed, and Colossus came to life. On December 8, 1943, Flowers ran the first full test. He fed in a sample Lorenz message, one of the intercepted German transmissions that had sat unreadable for months. The paper tape threaded through the reader. The photoelectric cells scanned the punched holes, and Colossus began processing. 5,000 characters per second. Heath Robinson, the machine Bletchley Park had pinned their hopes on, could manage 1,000 characters per second on a good day. Colossus was 5 times faster. And unlike Heath Robinson, it did not break down every few hours. The tubes ran cool and stable. The circuits held synchronization. The logic gates processed the cipher text exactly as Flowers had designed them to do. The test message decoded perfectly. Flowers had been right. 1,800 vacuum tubes could work together flawlessly if you understood the engineering. the so-called experts, had been wrong. In January 1944, they dismantled the machine, loaded it onto a truck, and transported it to Bletchley Park under armed guard. Reassembly took days. The racks had to be repositioned, the wiring checked, the tubes tested again. But on February 5, 1944, Colossus processed its first operational Lorenz message. It worked. The code breakers watched in stunned silence as the machine tore through calculations that would have taken Heath Robinson weeks. Patterns emerged. The German cipher settings revealed themselves. Within hours, they had readable German high command communications, Hitler's orders, Rommel's assessments, Wehrmacht troop movements. The intelligence was pure gold. And suddenly, impossibly, they had access to all of it. Max Newman, the mathematician who had first approached Flowers, immediately requested more machines. Not one, not two, 10 more Colossus computers, each one improved based on the lessons learned from the prototype. Bletchley Park, which had refused to fund the first machine, now could not build them fast enough. Flowers and his team went back to Dollis Hill and started again. By June 1944, they had delivered Colossus Mark II, even faster and more capable than the original. By the end of the war, 10 Colossus machines were running at Bletchley Park, processing thousands of German messages, giving the Allies a window into the enemy's most secret plans. Lorenz, the unbreakable cipher, had been broken, and the man who did it was a post office engineer from the East End who had spent his own money because no one else believed in him. But the real impact was still to come. In April 1944, Colossus decrypted a message that saved thousands of lives. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Atlantic Wall defenses, had sent a detailed report to Berlin describing his forces in Normandy. Tank positions, artillery placements, infantry strength, coastal fortifications, everything. The Allies read it all. But more than that, they intercepted another message that changed the entire invasion plan. German intelligence had identified a possible drop zone for American paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église. What the message revealed was chilling. The Germans had positioned a panzer division directly in that area, expecting the drop. If the American 82nd Airborne had jumped there as originally planned, they would have landed directly on top of German tanks. It would have been a massacre. The drop zones were changed. The paratroopers landed elsewhere. They survived. This was what Colossus made possible. Not abstract intelligence, not vague assessments, precise, actionable information that kept men alive and gave commanders the knowledge they needed to make decisions. Every day, Bletchley Park processed dozens of Lorenz messages. Every day, Colossus gave them a window into German strategic thinking. The intelligence was so detailed, it bordered on the absurd. The Allies knew Hitler's daily schedule. They knew when he held conferences with his generals, what he discussed, which divisions he ordered where. They knew that Rommel was arguing for more mobile reserves near the coast, while von Rundstedt wanted them held back inland. They knew that the German High Command was paralyzed by indecision, unable to agree on where the invasion would come. And they exploited every bit of it. By late May 1944, all 10 Colossus machines were operational at Bletchley Park, running around the clock. The Mark II models were faster than the prototype, capable of processing even more complex Lorenz settings. The codebreakers fed them intercepted messages continuously. Each machine could crack multiple messages per day. By some estimates, Colossus processed more than 63 million characters of German cipher traffic during the war. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, The Allies knew where the strongest defenses were. They knew where Rommel expected the attack. They knew which beaches were most vulnerable. They knew that Hitler believed the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy, and they exploited that belief ruthlessly. Even after the landings began, Hitler kept panzer divisions near Calais for weeks, convinced that Normandy was a diversion. By the time he realized his mistake, the Allies had established an unbreakable foothold. The invasion succeeded. Normandy was secured. The liberation of Europe began. But Colossus did not stop working. As Allied forces pushed inland through France, Colossus continued reading German communications, troop movements, supply routes, defensive plans. When the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, Colossus gave the Allies critical intelligence about German fuel shortages and ammunition reserves. The Wehrmacht was running on fumes, throwing everything into one last gamble. Knowing that allowed Allied commanders to hold their ground and wait for the offensive to collapse. In the final months of the war, Colossus revealed the Wehrmacht's retreat plans from France, the positioning of V-weapon launch sites, and Hitler's increasingly erratic orders as the Third Reich crumbled. The intelligence was so comprehensive that Allied commanders could anticipate German moves before the Germans themselves had fully committed to them. The strategic advantage was incalculable. Every broken Lorenz message was another piece of the puzzle, another advantage, another opportunity to save lives and shorten the conflict. The Germans never knew their highest-level communications were being read. They trusted Lorenz implicitly. That trust was their undoing. Could the war have been won without Colossus? Yes. The Allies had more men, more resources, more industrial capacity. Victory was likely inevitable. But at what cost? How many more men would have been lost, hitting prepared defenses they did not know were there? How many months would the advance have taken without the intelligence advantage Lorenz decrypts provided? Historians who have studied the Colossus records estimate that access to German high command communications shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years. 2 years. The fighting in Europe ended in May 1945. Without Colossus, it might have dragged on into 1947. Millions more casualties. Millions more civilians trapped under occupation. Cities like Prague and Vienna, spared late in the war, might have been destroyed in protracted street fighting. The Holocaust continued as long as the war did. Every month the war was shortened meant tens of thousands of lives saved. Tommy Flowers, with his £1,000 and his post office engineers, had changed the course of history. But the world would not know that for another 30 years. May 8, 1945, victory in Europe. The war was over. The celebrations began. In London, crowds filled Trafalgar Square and the Mall, cheering, singing, embracing strangers. Churchill addressed the nation. Servicemen prepared to come home. Britain had won. And then came the order to destroy everything. Winston Churchill himself gave the directive. All evidence of Colossus was to be eliminated. The machines dismantled. The blueprints destroyed. The very existence of the project buried under the Official Secrets Act. 8 of the 10 Colossus computers were taken apart, piece by piece, their components scattered or melted down. 2 machines survived, relocated to the newly formed government communications headquarters at Eastcote, where they would continue secret work monitoring Soviet communications during the Cold War. But their existence remained classified. The reason was coldly logical. Britain wanted to keep reading encrypted communications after the war. If the world knew that Lorenz had been broken, Other nations would abandon teleprinter ciphers and develop new systems. Better to let everyone believe that Lorenz was still secure. Better to let the technology remain secret, so Britain could continue using it against new enemies. The Soviets, after all, were already beginning to look less like allies and more like threats. Tommy Flowers was ordered to destroy his own work. The blueprints, the circuit diagrams, the technical specifications that had taken 11 months of brutal effort to create, all of it had to be burned. He gathered them together, took them to the incinerator, and watched them turn to ash. Years later, he would say, "That was a terrible mistake. The knowledge, the innovation, the engineering breakthroughs that could have revolutionized computing, all gone." Flowers had not just built a code-breaking machine, he had built the first programmable electronic computer, with concepts and techniques that would become the foundation of the digital age. But instead of sharing that knowledge with British industry, with universities, with the engineers who could have built on it, the government buried it. Britain had a head start in computing that should have been insurmountable. By 1945, they had 10 working electronic computers, years of operational experience, and the engineering expertise to build more. Imagine if that knowledge had been released. British companies could have dominated the emerging computer industry. British universities could have trained the next generation of computer scientists with actual working machines. The entire trajectory of technological development could have been different. Instead, the secrecy condemned British computing to decades of playing catch-up. While Flowers sat silent, unable to speak about what he had built, other nations started from scratch, reinventing techniques he had already perfected. The advantage Britain had earned through Flowers' genius was thrown away for the sake of Cold War intelligence operations that, in hindsight, delivered far less value than open technological leadership would have. The 50 engineers who had built Colossus were scattered back to civilian life. Some stayed at the post office, others found work in the nascent electronics industry, but none of them could put "designed and built the world's first programmable computer" on their resumes. That experience, that expertise, was locked away. They had to pretend they had spent the war doing routine maintenance work. Bletchley Park was shut down. The staff were dispersed, sent back to their pre-war lives, sworn to secrecy. They were not allowed to tell their families what they had done. Not their spouses, not their children. For 30 years, the people who had shortened the war, who had saved countless lives, had to remain silent while the world credited others. Tommy Flowers returned to the General Post Office. The man who had built the world's first programmable computer went back to designing telephone exchanges. His wartime contribution? Classified. His achievement? Erased. His sacrifice? Forgotten. He received an MBE in 1943, but the citation was vague, offering no explanation of what he had actually done. To anyone who looked at his record, he was just another civil servant who had done some unspecified work during the war. Nothing special, nothing remarkable, and the world moved on without him. February 15th, 1946. Less than a year after the war ended, the University of Pennsylvania held a press conference in Philadelphia. They unveiled ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. 30 tons of equipment, 18,000 vacuum tubes. The newspapers called it a marvel, a revolution, the dawn of a new age. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. Electronic computer flashes answers, may speed engineering. The coverage went global. Britain's own newspapers picked it up. The BBC reported it. ENIAC was hailed as the first electronic computer in history, an American triumph of innovation and engineering. The publicity was relentless. ENIAC appeared in Life magazine, Scientific American, Popular Mechanics. Newsreel footage showed the massive machine filling an entire room at the University of Pennsylvania, journalists marveling at the rows of glowing tubes. The inventors, John Bletchley and J. Presper Eckert, gave interviews, explained the technology, accepted accolades. They were invited to conferences, offered consulting contracts, courted by investors. The narrative solidified quickly. America had invented the computer. America had entered the electronic age first. Tommy Flowers read the articles in silence. He knew the truth. ENIAC had been switched on for the first time in December 1945, 2 years after Colossus became operational. ENIAC was not even programmable in the same way Colossus was. To change its function, engineers had to physically rewire it, moving cables and resetting switches. Colossus could be reprogrammed with new instructions in minutes. ENIAC took days, but Flowers could not say any of that. The Official Secrets Act bound him. If he spoke, he would go to prison. So he watched the Americans take credit for what he had already achieved, watched the world celebrate their accomplishment, watched British newspapers praise American ingenuity. He later wrote about that moment with restrained bitterness. I had to endure all the acclaim given to that enterprise without being able to disclose that I had anticipated it. Endure. That was the word he used. Not witness, not observe. Endure. It was not just personal pride at stake. The secrecy was damaging Britain's technological future in real time. British companies that might have invested in computing had no idea the technology already existed. British universities that could have built computer science departments from scratch had no access to the knowledge Flowers and his team had developed. Young engineers who might have pursued computing careers went into other fields because, as far as they knew, computing was an American innovation happening across the Atlantic. The injustice went beyond stolen glory. It became personal, humiliating, absurd. After the war, Flowers wanted to expand his work at the post office. He needed funding, so he approached the Bank of England for a loan. He explained his plans. He mentioned, carefully, that he had experience building large-scale electronic systems with thousands of vacuum tubes. The bank refused. Impossible, they said. No one could make that many tubes work reliably. He was clearly exaggerating, perhaps even lying. They would not lend money based on fantasy claims. Flowers could not tell them that he had already built 10 machines with 1,800 tubes each. He could not show them photographs, blueprints, or testimony from the engineers who had worked with him. All of it was classified. So the bank dismissed him as a dreamer, and he walked away empty-handed. The rejection stung in ways the bankers could never understand. Flowers had spent his own savings, risked his financial security, worked himself to exhaustion building Colossus. And now, when he tried to leverage that expertise for legitimate peacetime work, he was called a liar. The government that had used his genius to win the war would not even vouch for him enough to secure a business loan. He had saved Britain. He had shortened the war. He had pioneered the technology that would define the next century. And he could not even get a bank loan. Meanwhile, in America, the ENIAC team were celebrated as heroes. John Bletchley and J. Presper Eckert became famous, launched companies, gave lectures, published papers. Universities taught their students about ENIAC as the birth of computing. Textbooks credited them with inventing the electronic computer. History was being written, and Flowers was not in it. The American narrative became entrenched. Computing was an American achievement. Silicon Valley would later claim the entire digital revolution as its birthright. The story that everyone learned, The story that went into encyclopedias and history books was that computing began in Philadelphia in 1946, not in London, not in 1943, not with a post office engineer who spent his life savings because his government would not. The irony was savage. Britain had won the race, but America took the trophy. Flowers had built the future, but the world would never know. And for 28 more years, he would have to keep silent. The Official Secrets Act held for 28 years. Through the 1950s, the 1960s, and into the 1970s, Flowers went to work at the post office, designed telephone systems, and said nothing about Colossus. His colleagues knew him as a competent engineer with a mysterious wartime record. Nothing more, but secrets that large cannot stay buried forever. In the early 1970s, the British government began declassifying wartime intelligence operations. Slowly, carefully, the story of Bletchley Park emerged. First came the revelations about Enigma and Alan Turing. The public learned about the codebreakers, the bombs, the incredible mathematical work that had broken German naval ciphers. Books were published. Documentaries were made. Turing became a household name. But Colossus remained hidden a little longer. The two surviving machines at GCHQ were still operational, still classified. The government wanted to protect the technology as long as possible. It was not until 1974 that the details finally began to surface in official histories. Captain F.H. Hinsley's Official History of British Intelligence in the Second World War mentioned Colossus briefly, cryptically. That was the first public acknowledgement. Tommy Flowers could finally speak. He gave interviews. He explained what he had built, how he had built it, why it had worked when everyone said it would not. Historians started to understand the scale of what had been hidden. Colossus was not just a footnote to the Enigma story. It was a separate, greater achievement. The first programmable electronic computer, operational 2 years before ENIAC. Faster, more sophisticated, more reliable. In 1977, Flowers was invited to speak at a conference on the history of computing. He stood before an audience of engineers and historians and described Colossus in detail for the first time. The applause was long and heartfelt, but it must have been bittersweet. 32 years late. 3 decades of silence while others took credit. Flowers continued working into his 70s, never truly retiring, always tinkering with new ideas. He held over 50 patents, most of them related to telecommunications. His work on electronic switching systems laid groundwork for modern digital phone networks. But by then, younger engineers dominated the field. Engineers who had grown up with computers, who had learned programming in university, who had never had to fight for funding or burn their own blueprints. In 1980, he received the Martlesham Medal from British Telecom, a belated acknowledgement of his contributions to telecommunications and computing. In 1983, he was honored again by the British Computer Society. Small gestures, decades overdue. He attended these ceremonies quietly, without bitterness, accepting the recognition with the same modesty he had shown throughout his life. He passed away on October 28, 1998, at his home in Mill Hill, London. The obituaries were respectful but brief. Most newspapers gave him a few paragraphs. The Times acknowledged his role in breaking Lorenz. The Daily Telegraph mentioned Colossus. But there were no state funerals, no national days of mourning. He was buried quietly, attended by family, and the handful of engineers who had worked with him at Dollis Hill. 10 years later, in 2008, a team of engineers and volunteers at Bletchley Park completed an extraordinary project. They rebuilt Colossus from scratch, using original blueprints that had survived, photographs, and the testimony of surviving engineers who had worked on the original machines. The reconstruction took 14 years. Tony Sale, a computer conservation specialist, led the effort, tracking down components, deciphering technical notes, interviewing the few remaining Colossus veterans. The rebuilt machine occupies the same room where Colossus once operated during the war. The reconstructed Colossus now sits in the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, a working tribute to Flowers and his team. You can visit it. You can see the racks of glowing vacuum tubes, the paper tape reader, the control panels. You can watch it run, processing data exactly as it did in 1944. And you can read the plaques that finally, properly, give credit to the man who built it. Tommy Flowers, son of a bricklayer from the East End, post office engineer, the man who invented the computer age with his own money because his government would not back him, the man who saved millions of lives and then had to watch silently as others were celebrated for his work, the man who was erased from history and then, decades later, written back in. His name should be as famous as Turing's, as recognized as Mauchly and Eckert. But it is not. Not yet. Most people have still never heard of him. The history books are still catching up. The textbooks are still being corrected. But now you know. Now you know who really built the first computer. Now you know the sacrifice, the brilliance, the injustice. Now you know the name that should never have been forgotten. Tommy Flowers. Remember it.